So this week, we're diving into something that might seem pretty basic when it comes to weight training.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's the concept of the perfect rep.
Mm-hmm.
We're looking at this report by Will Brink and
The perfect rep.
yeah, perfect rep. And it really argues that this is kind of the absolute foundation of building muscle. When you look at all the training advice that's out there, it can get pretty overwhelming. We've all been there, right?
Well, yeah.
All these different routines and all these theories about how to train. So our mission today is to kind of cut through that noise and really focus in on why the way that you perform each rep, each individual repetition is so crucial for muscle growth, no matter what kind of program you're following.
Yeah, and what's really interesting is that Brink's report really focuses on how we can get so distracted by, all of the bells and whistles, all of the advanced training theories, all the supplements, the diet plans, and we kind of forget that fundamental element, that most basic element, which is the repetition itself. He makes a pretty good case that a lot of people really plateau or they underachieve simply because they haven't really mastered how to do each rep correctly.
It's almost like he's saying that it's not always what exercises you're doing, it's the quality of each movement that really dictates how much muscle you're going to build.
Exactly.
So let's kind of break this down. Why is this single repetition so incredibly important?
Well, I mean, if you think about it in the context of your overall training, the rep is really the most fundamental aspect of growth. When it comes to weight training. Every single exercise, every set that you perform, any training philosophy that you subscribe to, ultimately it all comes down to these individual reps. And if those individual reps are flawed, then Brink really argues that the rest of it, whether it's your exercise selection or your program structure, even the advice that you're getting from, world-renowned coaches, all of that gets really undermined.
Right.
It's like trying to build a really strong chain, but with weak links.
Yeah, it's a great analogy. I mean, it really highlights that a flawed rep is a fundamental breakdown. And Brink asks a really interesting question in this report. What if you focused on making every single rep a good rep? Just imagine what that kind of cumulative effect could have on your training.
Exactly. And what's interesting to note is that the report intentionally doesn't really go too deep into the physiology of muscles and all the, the super complex science behind it. It really keeps the focus on what is that observable outcome? Are you providing the stimulus to the muscles that they need to actually grow? Not too little that nothing happens, not too much that you get injured.
Right.
It's all about that sweet spot.
And that kind of leads into a really key point that he makes.
Yeah.
And that is that it's not just about the weight that you're lifting. It's actually more about the tension or the stress that your muscles experience during each rep.
Absolutely. That's a really important distinction to understand. He uses a really good example using the bench press.
Yeah.
Is it better to heave 405 pounds off your chest for a single rep, maybe bouncing it off your chest and really locking out those elbows at the top? Is that really more of a growth stimulus for your chest than, say, lifting a very controlled 300 pounds through a full range of motion, no bouncing whatsoever, and maybe stopping just short of lockout for, say, 10 reps?
Yeah. I mean, when you picture those two scenarios in your mind, it really highlights that just moving a heavy weight from point A to point B isn't the ultimate goal.
Yeah.
Right? It's the quality of that movement and the tension that you're putting on that muscle.
Exactly. The weight is just a tool, but it's the context and how you're using that tool to actually create the tension. Of course, all other things being equal, if every rep is perfect and you're doing a given exercise, then progressively increasing that weight is what drives muscle growth.
Yeah.
But chasing those heavy numbers at the expense of form and that tension, it can be really counterproductive.
Okay. So the report also kind of expands on this by explaining that muscle growth isn't just a localized event in the muscle fibers themselves. He talks about this concept of the metabolic cost of exercise, which is essentially, the energy demands and the byproducts of exercise, and how weight training actually triggers this systemic response throughout your body. So why is this broader response so important for muscle growth?
Well, what's really interesting here is that when you subject your muscles to enough load and intensity, you're creating those microscopic tears or microtrauma to the muscle fibers.
Right.
And that primarily happens during the eccentric or the lowering portion of the rep.
Okay.
Now, that local damage is a part of the signal for muscle repair and growth, but Brink really emphasizes that it's not as simple as just damage and repair.
Right. So it's not just breaking down the muscle.
Not exclusively, no. It's really about this idea of the metabolic cost of exercise, and how it's impacting your entire system. For example, when you do intense weightlifting, it leads to an increase in lactic acid buildup in the muscles and the bloodstream.
Right.
And research suggests that this actually is linked to the release of growth hormone, which is a really important hormone that stimulates muscle growth.
That's fascinating.
So it's that systemic response, those increasing levels of lactate that's triggering that growth hormone release.
So it's not just the muscle group that you're working,
Yeah.
it's the entire body.
Exactly. And he also points out that your body produces a bunch of other metabolic byproducts and signaling molecules during weightlifting
Right.
that contribute to that muscle building environment. He also uses the example of people who are new to weight training.
Okay.
They often experience really rapid strength gains in the initial WITs without any significant muscle growth.
Right.
And that's mostly because the nervous system is getting more efficient at activating the muscle fibers. So it's a neural adaptation rather than actual changes to the muscle tissue itself.
Oh, that makes sense. Your brain and your muscles are kind of learning to communicate and work together more effectively.
Exactly. So it's really a complex interplay between the nervous system, the endocrine system,
Okay.
the hormones, and a bunch of different enzymatic pathways.
So understanding that broader response really kind of lays the groundwork for what he calls the continuous tension non-lockout rep,
Yes.
or what he calls the CTNL rep.
The CTNL rep.
So what exactly is a CTNL rep?
Well, the basic principle of a CTNL rep is to keep the maximum amount of tension or stress on that muscle group during the entire set.
Okay.
And he argues that this is probably the most metabolically demanding type of repetition you can do, especially when you're doing it for moderate to high reps.
Okay, so metabolically demanding, meaning it requires more energy and produces more of those growth-related byproducts, right?
Exactly. So because of that, it leads to a greater systemic effect. You're getting more of those metabolites like lactate, which we know can increase growth hormone. The really important part is that with CTNL reps, that muscle is under tension for almost 100% of the time
Wow.
during the set.
That sounds intense. So practically speaking, how do you actually incorporate this into your training? What does a perfect CTNL rep actually look and feel like?
So he recommends a specific tempo or cadence, about 3 to 4 seconds for the eccentric or the lowering phase of the movement, and around 2 seconds for the concentric or the lifting phase. Now, what's really interesting to think about is that as we get tired during a set, we naturally tend to speed up our reps and our form gets a little bit looser.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I'm definitely guilty of that. Just trying to get those last few reps out.
Exactly. But the challenge and really the benefit of CTNL reps is to fight that urge
Okay.
and maintain that pace and that rhythm from the very first rep to the last rep,
Okay.
even when you start to feel that lactic acid burn.
So what about the non-lockout part? How does that help to maintain that tension?
So that's all about eliminating any point in the range of motion where that tension could leave the muscle. So let's take the squat, for example. Usually at the top of the squat, you lock out your knees.
Right.
And that gives your quads and your hamstrings and glutes a split second to relax.
Right.
With a CTNL rep, as you come up to that top position, you'd immediately reverse direction in a controlled manner and go right back down. So you're keeping that tension on the legs during the entire rep.
So you're essentially taking out any resting points within that repetition.
There's no breaks.
It sounds really physically demanding, but also mentally challenging as well. Just having to fight that urge to kind of rest or speed up.
It is. He talks a lot about the mental fortitude that's required to actually do these CTNL reps. You're going to feel that burn, and the temptation to speed up or rest is going to be huge. And he also points out that you're probably going to have to use less weight than you're used to because CTNL reps, when done properly, are much more demanding.
Yeah, that makes sense because you're really prioritizing that muscle contraction over the actual weight.
Exactly.
So is this style of rep universally the best for all different types of training goals? For example, what about if someone wanted to maximize their strength?
Well, he does say that you can build strength using CTNL reps, but it might not be the most optimal way if your main focus is to, lift the absolute heaviest weight possible.
Got it.
So CTNL is really effective for stimulating hypertrophy or muscle growth because of the time under tension and because of that high metabolic stress that it creates. He also mentions that you might find that you need fewer sets per body part when you're training this way.
Fewer sets, but each one is much more challenging.
Exactly.
What about the number of repetitions? Does the CTNL method work better with any specific rep ranges?
He does say that moderate to higher rep ranges tend to be more effective.
Okay.
He mentions that higher reps, like 15 to 20, can be really good for legs after
Oh.
you've done a few heavier sets. He jokes that you haven't really trained legs until you've done a set of 20 CTNL reps on squats
With a challenging weight.
with a challenging weight, yeah. And he also makes it clear that you can apply CTNL to pretty much any exercise.
Oh, wow.
It doesn't have to be a compound movement. It can be, bicep curls or pretty much anything.
So it's a principle that you can kind of use across the board.
Hmm.
What about overall training volume? How many sets per muscle group does he recommend with CTNL?
So he gives some general guidelines. He says no more than about 8 to 10 total sets for larger muscle groups like legs, back, and chest. And maybe around 6 to 8 for smaller muscle groups like biceps, triceps, and delts. And he stresses that because it's so demanding, you really got to be careful about overtraining if you're doing too much volume.
So it really is quality over quantity when it comes to this method. He also gives some tips for how to actually implement this successfully. What are some of the key takeaways there?
One of the really important things he talks about is progressive resistance. And he stresses that this doesn't always mean adding more weight to the bar.
Okay.
Progressive overload can also be achieved by doing more reps with the same weight,
Right.
doing more sets with the same weight, or even just shortening the rest periods between sets. All of those things are going to increase the stress on your muscles and lead to more growth. So don't get too hung up on just adding weight every single week.
That's a good point. Progressive overload has many different faces. What about when you get to a point in the set where you can't do another full controlled rep? What does he say to do at that point?
Well, he gives a few different options, but he's very cautious about overusing intensity techniques.
Okay.
You could just end the set right there. You
Okay.
could do a few forced reps with a spotter.
Mm-hmm.
You could do a few negative reps where you just focus on the lowering portion.
Right.
You could maybe try some cheat reps depending on the exercise.
Mm-hmm.
And you could even just reduce the weight a little bit and try to get a few more reps out.
Okay.
But he generally recommends that most of the time it's best to just end the set when you can't do a full CTNL rep anymore because the intensity is already so high.
Right. Because you're risking overtraining
Exactly.
if you push it too far. And any final thoughts on those optimal rep ranges based on the muscle group?
Yeah, so he reiterates that for upper body, a rep range of 8 to 12 is generally a good sweet spot for getting that microtrauma and that metabolic cost.
Okay.
But for legs, because it's a bigger muscle group, you can usually go a little bit higher
Okay.
while still maintaining the CTNL form.
So I guess to sum it all up, this deep dive into Will Brink's report really highlights just how important something as seemingly simple as the repetition is for building muscle.
It's everything.
It really seems like focusing on how you move the weight can be even more important than what weight you're actually moving.
Absolutely. And what's really amazing is that the idea of a perfect rep might sound so basic,
Right.
But if you can really master it, it can be a game changer in your training. He even mentions in the report that some people might think this is too simple, but he really argues that you cannot overstate the importance of it.
So that leads us to our final thought for everyone listening today. Really take a moment to think about your own training and how you're doing your reps.
Yeah.
How much are you really focusing on that continuous tension and that controlled movement throughout your sets?
Are you getting those perfect reps?
Yeah, could a simple change in how you're approaching each rep be that key to unlocking some new muscle growth and some new strength gains?
It might be the missing piece.
Yeah, maybe in your next workout, make a real conscious effort to pay attention to how much tension you're putting on that target muscle throughout the whole range of motion of every rep.
I think you'll be surprised.
And you never know, maybe even a concept that seems this simple could have some even deeper layers to uncover in some future deep dives.
Yeah, who knows?
Thanks for joining us.